I am Joshua, 32 years old, and my own parents just tried to kick me out of the only home I've ever owned to give it to my golden boy younger brother. Before I tell you about the shocking $780,000 trap I set that completely destroyed their reality, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Thank you for being here. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and listen to the whole story. I stared at the elegantly set dinner table, watching the thick, savory steam rise from the perfectly arranged Sunday roast. The familiar scent of roasted rosemary, garlic, and thyme filled our family's formal dining room. It was a room designed for showing off, not for comfort. Heavy velvet drapes framed the windows, and the crystal chandelier overhead cast a sharp, unforgiving light on all of us. But tonight, something felt vastly different. The air in the room was incredibly heavy. It felt like the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for a glass to shatter. Joshua, pass the potatoes. My father, Arthur, commanded without even bothering to look in my direction. He was a man who demanded absolute authority in every room he entered. His voice carried that stern, dismissive edge I had grown so entirely used to over the years. It was the exact tone of voice you would use to address a waiter who had brought you the wrong drink. A tone that suggested my mere presence at his mahogany table was a profound inconvenience. I was 32 years old, single, and according to my family, the ultimate undeniable disappointment of our prestigious bloodline. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom with their narrow, status-obsessed minds, was that I had spent the last 6 years quietly building a corporate empire they couldn't even begin to comprehend. Did you hear the spectacular news about Carter? My mother, Eleanor, asked, her voice dripping with absolute adoration. Her perfectly manicured hands gestured grandly toward my younger brother sitting directly across from me. He just got a massive promotion. He was named the youngest junior partner at his law firm in the company's entire history. The senior partners are simply thrilled with him. Carter leaned back in his expensive chair and smirked, swirling the red wine in his crystal glass. At 29, he had always been the golden child, the flawless prodigy, the one who blindly followed the exact path our parents had meticulously mapped out for him since he was in grade school. He got the massive college fund, the private tutors, the country club memberships, and the right friends. He did everything right while I was always the quiet observer, the one who didn't quite fit into their perfect country club mold. That's wonderful, I said smoothly, keeping my face entirely blank. I took a small, slow bite of the roast beef. I could feel their eyes boring into me, waiting. They were practically begging for a sign of jealousy, a twitch of resentment, or a pathetic plea for their approval. I gave them absolutely nothing. My silence was a wall they couldn't climb. Speaking of success, my father began, placing his heavy silver fork down on his china plate with deliberate slowness. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and locked his cold, gray eyes on mine. We need to discuss the house situation, Joshua. My stomach tightened, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. I knew exactly what was coming. 6 years ago, when I left my suffocating corporate job to start my own real estate business, they laughed right in my face. They called it a quarter-life crisis. They said I'd come crawling back, begging for a loan when the harsh reality of the market hit me. Instead, I worked in absolute, unbreakable silence. I built a portfolio that now included dozens of highly profitable commercial and residential properties across the city. But they didn't know a single detail about that. As far as Arthur and Eleanor were concerned, I was barely surviving. They firmly believed I was a struggling failure, living in the old family home purely out of their sheer, unmerited generosity. The exact same home my grandmother Rose had left exclusively to me in her will. Joshua, my father continued, his voice growing hard, flat, and uncompromising. He leaned his elbows on the table, invading my space from across the wood. Your mother and I have decided it's time for a major change. Carter is getting married to Sarah. He needs a proper family home now that he's making partner. Somewhere upscale to start his own family and host his clients. I took another small bite of my dinner, chewing slowly to control the sudden spike of adrenaline in my veins. I see. Don't act dense, Josh, Carter cut in, leaning forward with an arrogant scoff. You've been living in that massive house rent-free for years. It's time someone responsible took over the property. Someone with a real career and a future. My mother nodded eagerly in agreement, her diamond earrings catching the light. We've already spoken to a top lawyer, dear. The house should have gone to your father in the first place. It's the family's legacy. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly when she made that will. It was a tragic mistake caused by her declining age. The insult to my grandmother's memory stung deeply, a sharp pain right in the center of my chest. She was the sharpest, most brilliant woman I had ever known. She was the only one who saw me clearly. My father reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legal document. He tossed it onto the table. It slid perfectly across the polished wood and stopped right next to my plate. We need you to sign this immediately. It formally transfers ownership of the property back to the family trust, where it rightfully belongs. I glanced down at the paper, reading the bold legal header, but I kept my hands resting quietly in my lap. I looked back up at my father. And if I don't sign it? Carter let out a sharp, mocking laugh that filled the room. Come on, Josh. Don't be an idiot. You can barely afford your weekly groceries. How long do you really think you can keep up the skyrocketing property taxes, the roof maintenance, and the mortgage payments on a place like that? If any of them had bothered to check the public county records, they would have known the massive mortgage was paid off 3 years ago. By me. But they never checked. They were too blinded by their own towering arrogance to even verify their assumptions. We're being incredibly generous, Joshua, my mother added, her voice dripping with fake, sickening pity. We will give you 3 full months to find a new place to rent. Maybe that little, rundown apartment complex on the east side. The one where your old yard guy lives. I felt my jaw clench. The house belongs to me, I said evenly, keeping my voice dangerously low. Legally and morally. It was Grandma Rose's dying wish. My father's face darkened instantly. The blood rushed to his cheeks, and a thick vein in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. Then you leave us absolutely no choice. He stood up forcefully, his heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His imposing frame cast a long, dark shadow right across the table. Leave your keys and get out. This house belongs to the family now. We will handle this through the courts, and we will crush you. I looked at each of them, taking a mental photograph of this exact moment. My father, rigid with a false sense of absolute authority. My mother, her lips pursed in deep, unwavering judgment. Carter, practically glowing with the unearned victory of a spoiled child getting exactly what he wanted. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into the front pocket of my trousers. I pulled out my heavy brass house keys. I held them over the table for a fraction of a second, watching their eyes track the movement. Then I let them drop. They made a soft, final clink against the polished mahogany. Thank you for dinner, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion as I stood up from the table. And thank you for making this far easier than I ever expected. I turned my back on my stunned family, walked deliberately down the long hallway, and let myself out the heavy oak front door. The night air was freezing, biting through my thin jacket, but I felt a burning heat radiating from my core. I got into my car, locked the doors, and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and sent a single text to my lead corporate attorney. It's time. Execute the maneuver tomorrow morning at exactly 9 a.m. I sat in the pitch darkness of my car, gripping the leather steering wheel, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. To fully understand why I was about to completely and ruthlessly destroy my family's financial reality, you have to understand what happened 6 years ago. 6 years ago, the sky above the city was a heavy, suffocating shade of gray. The air smelled of damp earth and impending rain. It was the day of my grandmother Rose's funeral. She was the undisputed matriarch of our family, a woman of razor-sharp wit, deep compassion, and even sharper business sense. While my parents worshipped empty social status and country club gossip, Grandma Rose valued true grit. She was a self-made woman who had survived the harshest economic downturns. And she was the only person in the world who ever looked past my quiet, introverted nature and saw a burning potential. The suffocating tension in the family started right after they lowered her casket into the ground. It erupted during the formal reading of her will. We were all gathered tightly in the dark, mahogany-paneled office of her estate attorney downtown. The air conditioning hummed loudly in the background. My father sat tall and rigid in his leather wingback chair, practically already counting the assets in his head. He fully expected to inherit everything. He was the eldest son, the polished face of the Williams family. He believed it was his birthright. But Grandma Rose always had a profound sense of poetic justice, even from beyond the grave. When the elderly lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and reached the specific clause about her primary estate, the sprawling, historic, multi-million-dollar house in the Heights district, the entire room went dead, terrifyingly silent. I leave the primary estate, its grounds, and all its original contents in their entirety to my grandson Joshua Williams. The lawyer read, his voice steady and formal. My father gripped the padded armrests of his chair so hard I saw his knuckles instantly turn a stark, bone white. "Excuse me?" he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. "There must be a massive clerical mistake. Joshua is 26 years old. He works a pathetic, dead-end entry-level job. He makes a miserable salary. He can't possibly manage the upkeep of a property of that magnitude. The inheritance was explicitly supposed to come to me. The document is legally binding, Arthur, signed and notarized in my presence." The lawyer replied calmly, not flinching at my father's outburst. Rose was entirely of sound mind. My mother gasped dramatically, placing a trembling, diamond-ringed hand over her chest as if she had been physically struck by a speeding car. Carter, sitting next to her, just turned and glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. I sat there frozen, completely stunned, holding a small, sealed envelope the lawyer had quietly handed me before the formal reading even began. Later that night, the rain finally began to fall in heavy sheets. I was sitting completely alone in the massive, echoing, dark halls of my new house. The silence was deafening. I carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope with a letter opener. Inside was a small, worn, leather-bound notebook and a handwritten letter on her personalized stationery. Joshua, the elegant handwriting read, "Your father measures the worth of a man by the designer label stitched inside his suit. I measure a man by what he is willing to build with his bare hands when absolutely no one is watching him. This house is your foundation. It is your shield. In this notebook are my private personal contacts, my ruthless investment strategies, and the brutal truth about the real estate market in this city. They will try to take this from you. Don't tell them what you're doing. Let them underestimate you. Use their arrogance against them. Silence is the ultimate strategy." I read that letter until the words were burned into my retinas. That tiny leather notebook became my absolute Bible. I realized in that dark, quiet room that the house wasn't just an inheritance. It was a test of my character. And I swore to myself right then and there that I was going to pass it no matter what it took. Exactly 2 weeks after the funeral, I put on my cheap suit, walked straight into my regional manager's office at the corporate logistics firm where I worked, and handed in my formal letter of resignation. The steady but pathetic salary wasn't worth crushing my soul anymore. I needed time. I needed complete freedom to study the volatile housing market. When I made the mistake of telling my parents I had quit, they were absolutely furious. "You are throwing your entire life away," my father yelled over the phone, his voice distorted by rage. "You have no ambition, Joshua. None. You're going to lose that beautiful house to foreclosure in less than a year, and let me make this perfectly clear. I will not bail you out when you come crying to me." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just quietly pressed the red button and hung up the phone. I started spending my days driving my beat-up sedan around the most run-down, forgotten, and distressed parts of the city. I was looking for abandoned properties, foreclosures, places the banks had written off as total losses. I had a little bit of savings, but nowhere near enough to hire a professional, full-scale construction crew. That's exactly when I ran into Samuel. Samuel had been our family's loyal groundskeeper and trusted handyman for 15 solid years. A few months prior to Grandma Rose's passing, my father had brutally fired him over a minor, completely fabricated misunderstanding about a landscaping bill. It was ruthless, unfair, and a pure power trip on my father's part. I found Samuel working a grueling minimum-wage graveyard shift at a massive corporate hardware store. He looked exhausted. I waited until his shift ended, bought him a large cup of black coffee at a diner across the street, and laid out my crazy plan. I told him I had found a foreclosed, rotting, fire-damaged duplex on the far east side of the city. It was incredibly cheap, practically being given away by the bank, but it needed massive, back-breaking structural work. Samuel, I have just enough capital to buy the deed outright and purchase the raw materials. I told him, looking him straight in the eyes. If you provide the skilled labor, the expertise, and teach me how to swing the hammer, we split the net profits 50-50 when we flip it. Samuel stared at me over the rim of his steaming coffee mug. His heavily calloused, weathered face slowly broke into a wide, genuine smile. You're a hell of a lot like your grandmother, kid. You've got a deal. For the next 8 grueling months, I lived a brutal double life. By day, I was in a cheap suit, relentlessly pitching to low-tier private lenders, aggressively structuring high-interest bridge loans, and studying complex municipal zoning laws until my eyes bled. By night and on the weekends, I was covered from head to toe in toxic drywall dust, wet paint and grime, working side by side with Samuel. We tore out rotten, termite-infested wood, desperately fixed burst plumbing pipes, and slowly brought that dead, ugly building back to vibrant life. When we finally put it on the market and sold it, the profit margin was absolutely staggering. But we didn't spend a single dime of it on ourselves. No new cars. No expensive dinners. We ruthlessly rolled every single penny of profit directly into purchasing the next distressed property. Then the next. And the next. Samuel wasn't just my hired contractor anymore. He was my trusted business partner. But to my arrogant family, I was still just the pathetic, unemployed loser aimlessly wandering around the halls of Grandma's empty house. While I was out there covered in sawdust, bleeding from scraped knuckles, Carter was shining blindingly bright under the family's glowing spotlight. He graduated near the absolute top of his class in law school. My parents, desperate to show off their golden child to their wealthy friends, threw a massive, obscenely expensive catered party at the elite local country club to celebrate his achievement. I attended out of a misplaced sense of obligation, wearing a decent but clearly older suit that I had bought off the rack years ago. The moment I walked through the heavy glass doors into the ballroom, my Aunt Clara cornered me. Clara was my mother's older sister, a bitter woman who treated malicious gossip like a highly competitive Olympic sport. "Oh, Joshua," she sighed dramatically, gripping my arm and giving me a highly patronizing pat on the shoulder. "Still living all alone in that big, dusty, empty house? Such a terrible shame. Look at your brother Carter. He is going to be a senior partner before he hits 30. Your poor mother worries about you constantly, you know. She wonders how you even afford to buy groceries without a salary." Aunt Clara then seamlessly pivoted, eager to spill more poison. "And speaking of disasters, did you hear about the messy divorce and custody battle the Henderson family is going through? Absolute nightmare. At least our family has Carter to uphold our reputation." I smiled politely, a completely fake, practiced smile, and gently removed her claw-like hand from my arm. "Excuse me, Aunt Clara. I need to get a drink." When it was finally time to sit down for the lavish 5-course dinner, I walked around the room looking for my place card. It wasn't at the main family table near the front stage. It wasn't even at the secondary table with the extended relatives. They had deliberately seated me at the very back of the massive room, right near the swinging kitchen doors, at a cramped table mostly occupied by the hired event planners and the backup photographer. I sat there in the shadows, watching from a distance as my father proudly stood up, tapped his crystal glass with a spoon, and raised a glass of expensive vintage champagne. "To Carter," he beamed, his voice booming proudly over the microphone system. "A brilliant son who brings true, undeniable honor to the Williams family name. A son who deeply knows the value of hard work, prestige, and ambition." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. I took a slow sip of ice water, washing down the incredibly bitter, metallic taste of rejection in my mouth. I could have stood up right then and there. I could have grabbed a microphone and shouted to the entire room that I had just closed a brutal, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal that very morning. I could have shoved my 8-figure corporate bank statements right in their smug faces. But I felt the weight of the little leather notebook in my jacket pocket. I remembered Grandma Rose's handwritten letter. "Let them underestimate you. Silence is the ultimate strategy." I quietly ate my dinner, left my congratulatory gift on the back table, and walked out the side door before the decadent dessert was even served. I drove straight to a rundown, massive commercial warehouse I had just purchased in a sketchy neighborhood, and spent the rest of the cold night mapping out the aggressive renovation plans under a single hanging light bulb. Their blatant disrespect was the greatest, most volatile fuel I could have ever asked for. Over the next 3 grueling years, the momentum of my business became an unstoppable freight train. Samuel and I moved aggressively from flipping cheap, single-family duplexes to acquiring massive, multifamily apartment buildings. I ruthlessly used the built-up equity from the flipped houses to secure larger, more complex commercial loans from private equity firms. I formally structured a holding company, Williams Capital Investment Group, but I was incredibly, painstakingly careful. I legally structured the LLCs and shell companies so deeply that my actual name was buried under impenetrable layers of corporate privacy laws. If anyone tried to look up the owners of the properties, they saw a faceless corporate entity registered in another state, not Joshua Williams. By year 4, our monthly cash flow was absolutely tremendous. And with that cash flow, I did the one specific thing my father was absolutely, fundamentally certain I would fail at. I paid off the entire remaining mortgage on my grandmother's house. I initiated a direct wire transfer of over $500,000, clearing the massive debt completely in one single afternoon. But I fiercely kept the secret. Whenever I visited my parents for their dreadful Sunday dinners, I deliberately drove an older, dented car. I purposefully wore basic, unremarkable clothes. I let them pay for my coffee if we met at a cafe. Behind the scenes, we started aggressively buying up prime, highly sought-after real estate in the prestigious Heights district, right under the arrogant noses of the city's clueless elite. I was sitting in high-rise boardrooms negotiating with major national retail chains, signing ironclad 10-year commercial leases, and building a massive network of fiercely loyal contractors, lawyers, and property managers. I was no longer the confused, grieving 26-year-old trying to figure out a basic Excel spreadsheet in an empty house. I had evolved into an apex predator in the real estate market, cold, calculating, incredibly patient, and completely devoid of fear. But I knew the fragile peace couldn't last forever. The dark storm was rapidly gathering on the horizon, and it started, as it always inevitably did, with my toxic family. 3 months ago, the delicate dynamic of our family completely shattered. Carter had officially gotten engaged to Sarah, the highly demanding, status-obsessed daughter of a prominent local municipal judge. Suddenly, the intense pressure for our family to project a flawless image of extreme wealth was higher than ever before. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had briefly stopped by my parents' sprawling suburban house to drop off some important mail that the post office had mistakenly delivered to my address. The heavy front door was slightly ajar, caught on the latch, so I quietly pushed it open and walked into the marble foyer. As I set the envelopes down, I heard hushed, urgent voices coming from the sunroom down the hall. It was my mother, Eleanor, and her venomous sister, Aunt Clara. Sarah is completely used to a certain, very high standard of living. Clara was whispering loudly, her voice echoing slightly on the tile floor. They absolutely cannot live in a basic starter home, Eleanor. It would look terribly embarrassing for Carter's image at the law firm, especially with the judge's family scrutinizing everything. I know, Clara, I know, my mother replied, sounding incredibly stressed and frantic. But finding suitable homes in the historic Heights district is virtually impossible right now. The market prices have absolutely skyrocketed because some massive, faceless corporate investment firm is aggressively buying up every single property on the grid. I leaned my back flat against the cold hallway wall, remaining perfectly, breathlessly still. That massive, faceless corporate firm driving up the market prices was me. I was the ghost haunting their real estate dreams. Well, Clara said smoothly, her voice taking on a dark, conspiratorial tone. There is one very specific house in the Heights. A very large, beautiful, historic house currently occupied by someone who isn't doing a single productive thing with his pathetic life. A cold, sharp spike of pure adrenaline hit the center of my chest. Arthur and I have already talked about it late last night, my mother admitted, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. We're scheduling a meeting with a high-powered estate lawyer next week. We think we can successfully challenge Rose's will in court. We'll claim she wasn't of sound mind, that she had dementia. If we can legally break the trust, the house automatically reverts to Arthur as the eldest son, and we can just legally evict Joshua with a 30-day notice. I completely stopped breathing. My own mother, the woman who gave birth to me. They were literally, systematically plotting to rip the very roof over my head, to destroy my grandmother's dying wish, just to impress Carter's incredibly spoiled new fiancé and protect their fragile social standing. The last, lingering, desperate shred of familial loyalty I had held onto for my entire life instantly vaporized. It burned away into cold, hard ash in that very second. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't scream. I set the mail down quietly on the polished console table, turned around on my heel, and walked silently back out to my car. They wanted a brutal war. They had absolutely no idea who they were declaring it against. But the exhausting family drama wasn't my only massive problem. On the brutal corporate business front, my aggressive expansion had finally caught the direct attention of Matthew, a ruthless, heavy-hitting, billionaire real estate developer who had monopolized and controlled the downtown commercial market with an iron fist for decades. Matthew despised competition, especially not from a mysterious, unknown entity like Williams Capital Investment Group. He noticed that someone was quietly but aggressively buying up the entire Heights district, actively cutting into his highly profitable territory. At that time, I had my eyes fiercely set on a massive, game-changing prize. The Century Building. It was a premium, 10-story, historic commercial office building located right in the beating heart of the downtown business district. Acquiring it would instantly, permanently elevate my company from a mid-level regional player to a top-tier corporate powerhouse. But Matthew desperately wanted it too. He started aggressively and maliciously outbidding me on smaller, unrelated properties just to force me to bleed my liquid cash reserves. He used his deep, corrupt political connections at the city zoning board to mysteriously stall my construction permits for months. Every single time I made a strategic move on the board, Matthew was right there, throwing a massive wrench into the gears, trying to bankrupt me. He's actively trying to choke us out of the market, Samuel told me one stressful afternoon, as we intensely reviewed the bleeding financials in our bustling downtown corporate office. Josh, if we tie up all our liquidity fighting him in a bidding war for the Century Building, and we lose, we're going to be dangerously over-leveraged and entirely exposed. I stood up and stared blankly at the massive, color-coded property map dominating the wall of my office. The pressure was immense, crushing down on my chest. My treacherous family was actively trying to legally steal my home, and Matthew was trying to financially destroy my life's work. I needed a flawless, utterly devastating strategy to simultaneously eliminate both massive threats. And then, just when I thought the pressure couldn't get worse, the situation deteriorated entirely. For years, I had been exclusively using a highly experienced commercial real estate broker named David. I genuinely trusted him. I had confided deeply in him about my absolute maximum financial bidding limit for the upcoming Century Building auction. One rainy evening, I was having a quiet, solitary dinner at an exclusive, dimly lit steakhouse downtown. I got up and walked toward the back hallway to use the restroom. As I passed a row of private VIP dining rooms, I glanced through the slightly cracked wooden door of one of them, and my heart stopped. David and Matthew, sitting together at a private table, laughing, sharing a $3,000 bottle of vintage wine. I instantly slipped into the dark shadows of the hallway, holding my breath, and listened intently. I'm telling you, Matt, he's going to completely max out at exactly $12 million in cash for the Century Building. David was telling Matthew, laughing softly, swishing the wine in his glass. If you aggressively bid 12.5, you'll lock his company out completely. He physically does not have the liquid cash flow to go a single dollar higher without defaulting. My blood instantly turned to freezing ice. David, my trusted broker, had completely sold me out for a quick, dirty payout from my worst enemy. I didn't storm in. I didn't flip the table. I walked calmly back to my table, paid my exorbitant bill in cash, and left the restaurant. I realized right then, gripping the steering wheel of my car in the rain, that David's disgusting betrayal wasn't a catastrophic disaster. It was a golden, incredible opportunity. I could weaponize my traitor. Early the very next morning, I called David into my corner office. I smiled warmly, poured him a cup of premium coffee, and looked him dead in his lying eyes. David, listen, I've run the complex numbers all night, I said, expertly faking a look of exhausted desperation, rubbing my temples. I'm officially dropping my pursuit of the Century Building. It's too risky. Instead, I'm going all in on the abandoned massive industrial park down by the polluted river. I'm willing to dangerously over-leverage the entire company to get it. I'm putting $15 million cash on the table. Keep it absolutely quiet. It's a gold mine. David's eyes lit up with sickening greed. He nodded frantically. Absolutely, Josh. Brilliant pivot. Smartest move you could make. I knew exactly what he would do the exact moment he walked out of my office. That industrial park was a legendary toxic nightmare. The soil was contaminated. It required tens of millions of dollars in mandatory environmental cleanup before a single brick could legally be laid. It was a complete, utter money pit. And I had just successfully convinced my traitorous broker to run and tell Matthew it was a secret gold mine. Exactly 2 days later, the trap violently snapped shut. Matthew, desperate to blindly crush me and steal what he thought was a hidden gem, aggressively outbid everyone and purchased the highly toxic industrial park, instantly locking up millions of his own liquid capital in a completely worthless, contaminated property. He was ruined. While Matthew was busy popping champagne and celebrating his disastrous victory, I quietly, effortlessly swept in and purchased the Century Building for a fraction of what Matthew originally would have paid. I successfully secured the absolute crown jewel of the downtown skyline. I was sitting in my stunning, brand new top-floor corner office in the Century Building, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass over the sprawling city, when my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. It was an abrupt text message from my mother. Joshua, Sunday dinner, 7 p.m. sharp. Do not be late. We have urgent, final family business to discuss regarding your living situation. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, dark realization washing over me. The Century Building, which I now owned entirely outright, had a very specific, highly lucrative anchor tenant. Taking up the entire 8th and 9th floors of my new building was a massive, prestigious corporate law firm. The exact same law firm where my golden boy brother Carter had just proudly been made junior partner. I literally owned the concrete roof over Carter's entire career. I was his ultimate landlord, and my parents were summoning me to dinner to try and steal the roof over my head. I smiled, a cold, hard, merciless smile in the empty office. I typed a brief reply to the text message. I'll be there. The Friday morning before that fateful Sunday dinner, I walked confidently into the sleek, modern, glass-walled corporate offices of Highland Mortgage Corporation. I wasn't walking in there as a struggling, desperate homeowner begging for an extension. I was walking in there as one of their largest, most powerful commercial clients. I bypassed the front desk completely and sat down heavily in the plush leather chairs of Julian's office. Julian was the senior vice president of commercial lending, a man who understood power better than anyone. Joshua, Julian smiled broadly, standing up and shaking my hand firmly across his massive desk. Congratulations on the Century Building acquisition. It was a brilliant, ruthless maneuvering against Matthew. The whole industry is talking about it. What can I do for you today, my friend? I need a massive favor, Julian. A highly specific, slightly unconventional, personal favor. I reached into my leather briefcase and slid a thin manila file across his polished mahogany desk. It contained the original, outdated mortgage paperwork for Grandma Rose's house, the exact mortgage my arrogant parents firmly believed was still active, in default, and under my name. 3 years ago, I completely paid this off through a subsidiary shell of my holding company, I explained, tapping the file. My father, however, is currently under the massive delusion that he has legal claim to seize this property because he thinks I'm defaulting on the payments. He thinks I'm broke. I need you to set up a highly automated, officially recorded call from your corporate compliance department directly to my father's personal cell phone. Julian raised a thick eyebrow, instantly intrigued by the drama. What kind of call exactly? A formal, legally binding notification of transfer, I said, leaning forward. I want your automated corporate system to call him at exactly 9 a.m. on Monday morning. I want it to clearly inform him that the $780,000 mortgage on the property has been fully satisfied and the absolute deed is permanently, legally transferred to Williams Capital Investment Group. Julian quickly read through the documents in the file. He let out a low, impressed whistle. They have absolutely no idea you own Williams Capital, do they? They have no idea about anything in my life, I said softly, the anger simmering just below my surface. Julian leaned back heavily in his expensive leather chair and grinned like a shark. I absolutely love the drama of real estate. Consider it done, Joshua. 9 a.m. sharp on Monday. And that brings us right back to Sunday night. After placing my heavy house keys on the dining room table and walking out on my furious, screaming father, my incredibly smug brother, and my deeply judgmental mother, I didn't drive back to the old house. I drove back to my actual home, a stunning, multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline. I walked into my massive home office, turned on the single warm desk lamp, poured myself a neat glass of expensive, aged bourbon, and sat down in the silence. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. A text from Samuel. Everything is prepped. The aggressive new commercial lease agreements for the Century Building are sitting on your desk. The formal residential eviction warnings for your parents are fully drafted by the legal team. Ready for war, boss. I picked up the phone and replied, see you at the office at 8:30 a.m. I stood up and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the endless grid of city lights below me. I thought deeply about the brutal years of insults, the cruel, hushed whispers at family holiday gatherings, the blatant, unashamed disrespect they had shown me since I was a child. They firmly thought they had backed a helpless, pathetic loser into an inescapable corner. They thought they had finally won. Tomorrow morning, they were going to brutally wake up in a terrifying world where I held absolutely every single card in the deck. I took a slow sip of the burning bourbon, feeling the heat spread through my chest, chasing away the cold ghosts of my past. At exactly 9 a.m., the bomb was going to drop, and I was going to be sitting right there in the front row, watching the absolute destruction of their perfectly curated, arrogant reality. Monday morning arrived with a bright, harsh sunlight that cut straight through the tall windows of Grandma Rose's house. I sat behind the heavy oak desk in the main study. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. It was exactly 8:45 a.m. I had driven over from my penthouse at dawn to prepare for this specific encounter. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the kind my father always claimed I could never afford. My laptop was open on the desk, the screen glowing brightly. At 8:52 a.m., I heard the aggressive crunch of gravel in the driveway. A heavy car door slammed. Then another. I didn't move. I just watched the front door security camera feed on my tablet. My father, my mother, and Carter were marching up the front steps. My father looked absolutely furious. Carter looked incredibly smug, wearing a designer suit he bought with his new promotion money. The heavy brass knocker pounded against the front door. "Joshua!" My father's voice boomed through the thick wood. "Open this door immediately. We are not playing games with you." I pressed a button on my desk console, remotely unlocking the front door. Clicked open. They stormed into the foyer, their expensive leather shoes echoing sharply on the hardwood floors. They found me sitting in the study, relaxed, sipping a cup of black coffee. "How dare you leave the dinner table like that?" my mother hissed, clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. "And how dare you break into this house after we told you to leave the keys?" "I didn't break in, Mother," I said calmly, setting my coffee cup down. "I own it, and I have spare keys." My father marched right up to the edge of the desk. He slammed his hand flat against the polished oak. "You arrogant little fool. I warned you last night. I'm calling my lawyer right now. We are filing an emergency injunction to seize this property and freeze your access to the premises. You are trespassing on family trust property." I glanced at the gold Rolex on my wrist. It was 8:59 a.m. "You can certainly call your lawyer, Arthur," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But I think you're going to want to take another phone call first." "What the hell are you talking about?" Carter snapped, crossing his arms. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. 9 o'clock. Right on cue, my father's cell phone began to vibrate violently in his jacket pocket. He ignored it, keeping his furious glare locked on me. But it kept ringing, a relentless, demanding buzz. "Answer it," I told him, keeping my voice dangerously low. He pulled the phone out, annoyed, intending to silence it. But he stopped. He stared at the caller ID. The screen clearly displayed the official corporate number for Highland Mortgage Corporation. He frowned, deeply confused, and pressed the answer button. He put the phone to his ear. "Hello? Yes, this is Arthur Williams." I sat perfectly still and watched his face. I watched the exact moment his entire reality collapsed. The automated, highly official voice of the compliance department began to speak. Because the room was so quiet, I could hear the faint, tinny words bleeding from the earpiece. "This is a formal, legally binding notification from Highland Mortgage Corporation. Please be advised that the outstanding mortgage balance of $780,000 on the property located in the Heights District has been fully satisfied and closed. The deed and all legal rights of ownership have been permanently transferred to Williams Capital Investment Group. No further claims on this property will be recognized." My father's face turned the color of wet ash. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hand began to tremble so violently he almost dropped the phone. "Arthur?" my mother asked, her voice tight with sudden panic. "Arthur, what is it? Who is calling you?" My father slowly lowered the phone. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute, terrifying shock. "The mortgage company. They said the debt is completely paid. Nearly $800,000. They said the house belongs to a corporate investment group. Williams Capital." Carter let out a nervous, highly pitched laugh. "That's impossible. There has to be a clerical error. Joshua doesn't have that kind of money. He doesn't even have a salary." I reached forward and smoothly turned my laptop around so the glowing screen faced all three of them. "There is no error, Carter," I said quietly. They stepped closer to the desk, their eyes fixed on the screen. I had my secure executive dashboard open. It displayed the entire, complex corporate structure of Williams Capital Investment Group. Right at the top, listed as the sole CEO and majority shareholder, was my name, Joshua Williams. Below my name was a heavily detailed map of the city. Scattered across the map, specifically concentrated in the highly coveted Heights District and the downtown commercial center, were 47 bright blue markers. What am I looking at? My mother whispered, her voice shaking violently. You are looking at my real estate portfolio, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Every single blue marker is a property fully owned and operated by my company, including this house. I paid off the massive inheritance debt 3 years ago in a single wire transfer. I just let you all completely believe I was failing because it was far simpler than dealing with your endless judgment. My father gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. His entire worldview was shattering into a million sharp pieces right in front of him. You own 47 properties? That's tens of millions of dollars. That's significantly more than the entire family trust. Yes, it is, I agreed. I moved the wireless mouse and clicked on a specific blue marker located right in the center of the downtown grid. A high-resolution photo of the Century Building popped up on the screen. But this one is my absolute favorite, I said, looking directly into Carter's eyes. Carter leaned in, squinting at the screen. The color rapidly drained from his face until he looked physically ill. That's the Century Building. That's where my law firm is located. Exactly, I smiled. Cold, merciless smile. I closed the acquisition deal last week in cash. I bought the building through a subsidiary shell company, which means, Carter, that your prestigious law firm, the one that just gave you that massive, highly celebrated promotion, rents their entire top-floor office space directly from me. Your firm's massive monthly rent payments literally fund my new acquisitions. Carter looked like he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. He stumbled backward, bumping into a leather armchair. The arrogant, golden boy sneer was completely wiped from his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated horror. He suddenly realized his entire soaring career was currently resting in the palm of the brother he had mocked and humiliated just 12 hours ago. You're my landlord, Carter whispered, his voice cracking horribly. I am, I replied, and I'm currently reviewing all the upcoming lease renewals. My mother sank heavily into one of the armchairs, pressing her manicured hands against her face. She was hyperventilating slightly. But how? She demanded, tears of shock welling in her eyes. How did you possibly do this? You had no capital. You had no office. You were working in the dirt. Where did you get the resources? I started incredibly small, I explained, leaning my elbows on the desk. I used my meager savings to buy a heavily fire-damaged, foreclosed duplex on the east side. I worked day and night. I ripped out the drywall myself. I fixed the plumbing. I renovated it with Samuel's help. My mother's head snapped up at the name. Samuel? Our old yard guy? The man your father fired? Yes, Mother, I said smoothly. The man you both treated like absolute garbage because he got his hands dirty. Right on cue, the heavy oak door of the study swung open. Samuel walked in. He wasn't wearing his old, stained work clothes. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit that cost more than my father's entire wardrobe. He carried a leather briefcase and looked every inch the powerful corporate executive he had become. Good morning, everyone, Samuel said, his voice deep, calm, and incredibly dignified. He didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. He just radiated absolute, undeniable power. My parents stared at him with their mouths hanging open. They were looking at a ghost they thought they had crushed. Samuel is not my yard guy, I told them, my voice ringing clearly in the quiet room. He is my highly trusted business partner. He currently owns 15% of Williams Capital. His personal net worth dwarfs our entire family's generational wealth, and he earned every single penny of it with his bare hands. My mother looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The absolute humiliation of realizing that the working-class man she had openly despised was now vastly more successful and powerful than her own husband was a psychological blow she couldn't process. Samuel walked over to the desk, opened his briefcase, and pulled out 3 thick, legal folders. He set them precisely on the edge of the desk, right in front of my father. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment 1 below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. What are these? My father asked, his voice completely broken, pointing a shaking finger at the folders. Those are formal, highly aggressive commercial lease agreements, I said, gesturing to the documents. We are officially running a business, Arthur. Business is business, isn't it? That's the cold, hard lesson you constantly tried to drill into my head when I was growing up. I opened the first folder and slid it toward Carter. Carter, this is the massive rent increase notification and the strict new lease terms for your law firm's office space. Since I now own the Century building, I have drastically reevaluated the current market rates. The rent is going up exponentially. You have until this Friday at 5 p.m. to have your senior partners sign this agreement. Carter stared at the paper, his hands trembling. Josh, if I take this to the senior partners, they'll be furious. A rent hike like this could destroy my promotion. They might even try to terminate the firm's lease. That is entirely your problem, Carter, I said coldly. If they refuse to sign by Friday, I already have 3 competing corporate law firms actively bidding on that premium top-floor space. I will serve your firm with a 30-day eviction notice on Monday morning. I then opened the second folder and slid it toward my father. And Arthur, I said, dropping the informal dad. This is a formal, legally binding cease and desist order drafted by my corporate attorneys. It explicitly bars you, Mother, and Carter from ever setting foot on this property, or any property owned by Williams Capital, without my express written permission. If you attempt to challenge Grandma Rose's will, my legal team will bury you in so much aggressive litigation that you will go completely bankrupt paying the legal fees. My father stared blindly at the legal documents. He looked 20 years older than he had when he walked through the front door. All of his bluster, his incredible arrogance, his desperate need to control everyone around him, it was completely gone, shattered into dust. You charge your own flesh and blood market rate rent? My mother asked, her voice cracking with tears. You threaten your own father with a lawsuit? The exact same way you were eagerly ready to make me completely homeless yesterday, I replied, my voice hard as steel. You gave me 3 months to pack my bags. I'm giving you until Friday to sign the papers. I'd say I'm being incredibly generous. A suffocating, heavy silence fell over the study. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the background. Years of cruel assumptions, dismissive sneers, and quiet, toxic condescension had all been completely violently shattered in a single, devastating morning. My father was the very first one to move. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up his copy of the legal documents. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten to call his lawyer again. He simply folded the papers and held them tightly against his chest. What do you actually want from us, Joshua? He asked, his voice a hoarse, defeated whisper. I want absolute respect, I said simply, holding his gaze without blinking. Not as your son. You have made your feelings incredibly, painfully clear on that front for my entire life. I want respect as a ruthless businessman who built something substantial, something incredibly real, right under your arrogant nose. My father nodded slowly. The fight had completely drained out of him. He looked at Samuel, gave a small, humiliating nod of surrender, and turned toward the door. My mother followed him, wiping her tears furiously with a tissue. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. Carter was the last one to leave. He stood by the leather chair, clutching the commercial lease agreement that held the fate of his entire career. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and sudden, profound realization. As my father reached the doorway of the study, he paused. He looked back over his shoulder. Did you know all this time? My mother whispered to him, her voice echoing in the hall. Did you have any idea what he was doing? No, my father replied, sounding completely hollow. We never really looked at him, Eleanor. We never really saw him. They walked out the front door, the heavy wood closing behind them with a soft, final click. I sat back down in my leather chair and let out a long, heavy breath. Samuel walked over to the side table and poured us both a cup of black coffee. He handed me a mug. "They finally see you now," Samuel said quietly, taking a sip. I nodded, staring out the window at their luxury car slowly pulling out of my driveway. "They see the power, Samuel. They don't see me yet, but maybe now they'll finally start looking." 1 full month after the massive confrontation in my study, the dust had finally started to settle. I was standing at the massive glass window of my newly opened corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. I had moved my main operations to the top floor of the Morrison building, another massive recent acquisition that offered a stunning, panoramic view of the entire city skyline I had slowly been reshaping. The dynamic of my family had completely fractured and shifted. My mother had taken to calling me almost daily. She constantly oscillated between highly apologetic reminiscence and thinly veiled, desperate attempts to understand my sudden, massive wealth. I kept the conversations extremely brief and professional. My father had retreated into a deep, stoic silence. He signed the legal cease and desist agreements without a single word of protest and mailed them back to my legal department. But Carter had been highly suspiciously quiet. My desk phone buzzed. It was Qley, my sharp, incredibly efficient executive assistant. "Mr. Williams," Qley's voice came through the speaker. "Your brother, Carter, is waiting in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it is extremely urgent." I frowned, looking out at the city. The firm Carter worked for had signed the aggressive new lease agreement a few weeks ago, drastically increasing their rent. I had assumed Carter had somehow managed to smooth things over with his senior partners. "Send him up to my office," I said. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my office slid open. Carter walked in. I almost didn't recognize him. The incredibly polished, arrogant swagger was completely gone. He wasn't wearing his usual crisp, designer suit. He wore a simple, slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and slacks. There were dark, heavy bags under his eyes. He looked completely defeated. "Nice office," Carter said quietly, glancing around at the modern art and the massive mahogany desk. "Significantly better than my firm's." "Your firm's lease was successfully renewed last month," I replied, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from my desk. "I assumed you were busy celebrating your promotion." Carter sank heavily into the chair and let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "That's exactly why I'm here, Josh. There is no promotion." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face carefully. "Explain." Carter rubbed his hands nervously over his face. "When I took the new lease terms to the senior partners, they were absolutely furious about the massive rent hike. But they had no choice but to sign it. Moving the entire firm would cost millions. However, when they did a corporate background check and found out that Williams Capital was fully owned by my estranged brother, he swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. They fired me, Josh. They completely let me go. Apparently, having a junior partner whose own brother is actively squeezing the firm for millions of dollars is considered a massive conflict of interest and bad for internal morale. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the information. My actions had caused a massive ripple effect that completely destroyed my brother's perfect life. "And Sarah?" I asked softly. Carter flinched as if I had hit him. "She called off the engagement. Once she found out I lost my massive salary and my prestigious position, the judge's family suddenly decided I wasn't a suitable match for their daughter anymore. It turns out they loved the title, not me." He looked up at me, his eyes completely bloodshot. "I lost everything, Josh. The career, the girl, the reputation. Everything the family built me up to be is just gone." "What do you want from me, Carter?" I asked, my voice steady. "Are you here for a loan? A handout?" He shook his head violently. No handouts. I guess I'm just here for understanding. I've spent the last month sitting in my apartment, going absolutely crazy. How did you do it? How did you build all of this right under our noses while we were constantly tearing you down? I thought about all those agonizing family dinners. I thought about sitting at the back table near the kitchen during his massive celebration. I thought about the thousands of tiny, sharp insults I had swallowed over the years. I learned directly from Grandma Rose, I said finally. I didn't just learn about real estate metrics. I learned about brutal patience. I learned about letting arrogant people underestimate you while you quietly build something undeniable. She always said you were incredibly smart, Carter. But she said you were completely blinded by your own ego. I just thought she was being kind to the failing, pathetic grandson, Carter murmured, his voice thick with shame. We all did. That assumption was my greatest weapon, I replied. I opened my laptop and quickly pulled up a highly detailed, 50-page document I had prepared several weeks ago. I turned the screen toward him. Your former law firm isn't failing financially just because of my rent increase, Carter. I told him, tapping the screen. It's slowly failing because their entire corporate business model is completely outdated. Their client acquisition strategy is incredibly weak, and their market analysis is surface-level garbage. Carter blinked, leaning forward to look at the complex data. How do you possibly know all this about my firm? Because I've been ruthlessly studying them for years, I said simply. Just like I study every single tenant, every competitor, and every potential weakness in the market. Carter stared at the screen, his sharp lawyer's mind quickly processing the data. This is a flawless, highly aggressive preliminary analysis of exactly where they are bleeding capital. You've mapped out exactly how to fix their entire operational structure. He looked up at me, incredibly confused. Why are you showing me this? I don't work there anymore. Because I am officially offering you a job, I said. The absolute shock on his face was comical. He actually stopped breathing for a second. You want me to work for you? I want you to work with me, I corrected him calmly. As an equal partner on the legal side of the corporate business. I am aggressively expanding Williams Capital into 3 new state markets next quarter. I need a brilliant, ruthless lawyer to head our entire legal department. Someone who knows how to navigate complex corporate zoning and aggressive acquisitions. I pulled a thick, printed contract out of my desk drawer and slid it across the table to him. But you need to understand something right now, Carter, I said, my voice turning incredibly hard. This is not about family charity. This is purely business. You will earn your place in this company, or I will brutally fire you myself, just like anyone else. He stared down at the employment contract. His hands were shaking. Does father know about this incredible offer? Arthur doesn't make my business decisions anymore, I replied coldly. Neither does Eleanor. That is the very first lesson you will need to rapidly learn if you accept this position. Carter picked up the contract, his eyes quickly scanning the legal clauses. His sharp instincts hadn't completely abandoned him. The base salary is 30% less than I was making at the firm. The base salary is, I agreed, nodding. But look at page 4. The equity compensation package is significantly higher. Another brutal lesson, Carter. Build actual ownership, not just a fleeting income. A small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The first real smile I had seen from him in years. Grandma Rose taught you that too, didn't she? Among many other things, I said, standing up and walking back to the massive window. She taught me that real, undeniable power isn't in the expensive suit you show people. It's in the empire you quietly build while they are busy looking the other way. Carter reached into his pocket, pulled out a pen, and signed the contract without a single moment of further negotiation. Another massive first for him. As he stood up to leave my office, he paused at the heavy glass door. He looked back at me, his expression completely humbled. I'm incredibly sorry, Josh, for everything, for all the years. I know, I said quietly. Now prove it by helping me build something even bigger. That evening, the autumn air was crisp and incredibly cold. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the quiet cemetery. I walked slowly up the small hill and stood before Grandma Rose's polished granite headstone. I placed a fresh bouquet of dark red roses gently against the stone. The wind rustled through the dying leaves of the nearby oak trees as I sat down on the small, cold stone bench we had often shared when I was a child. "You were absolutely right," I said softly to the wind. "About everything. About letting them believe whatever they wanted while I aggressively built exactly what I needed. About brutal patience being infinitely more powerful than loud pride." I told her quietly about the massive corporate expansion plans. I told her about humbling Carter and bringing him into the fold. I told her about the unstoppable empire that had aggressively grown from the tiny seed of her initial handwritten lessons. I like to think she would have been incredibly proud, not just of the massive financial success, but of exactly how I had achieved it. Without screaming, without begging, just pure, relentless strategy. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a text message from my mother, Eleanor. "Joshua, we would love to have Sunday dinner this week. We were hoping, if it isn't too much trouble, we could have it at your house." It was a tiny, incredibly loaded message. A massive acknowledgement of the new reality. She wasn't commanding me. She was asking for permission to enter my domain. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed back a simple one-word reply. "Yes, let them come. Let them sit quietly at my massive table, in my beautiful home, completely surrounded by my undeniable success. Let them finally, truly see what had been standing right in front of them all along. A man who took their toxic underestimation and forged it into an unbreakable empire. Because sometimes, the absolute quietest person in the crowded room is the exact one you should be watching the most carefully. Sometimes, the child the family so easily dismisses becomes the unstoppable force they can no longer ignore. And sometimes, silence isn't a sign of weak surrender. Silence is a strategy. I looked up at the darkening purple sky, feeling the massive weight of everything I had built settle comfortably on my shoulders. "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered into the cold air, "for teaching me the terrifying power of being underestimated." Then I stood up, pulled my coat tight, and walked back down the hill to my car, ready to continue building, growing, and leading. Not to prove anything to them anymore. Never again for them, but purely for myself. Because I wasn't just the disappointment Joshua anymore. I was the CEO of an unstoppable real estate empire, the absolute owner of half the city's prime skyline, and living, breathing proof that the greatest revenge isn't in the angry words you scream. It's in the massive empire you quietly build while they aren't looking. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's been a long, exhausting journey, but sharing it with you all makes it feel like it was meant to happen for a reason. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt undervalued by the people who are supposed to support you the most. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, where you had to quietly build your strength while everyone else doubted you? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. If you made it all the way to this exact moment, you belong to the 1% Club. Do me a huge favor and comment the letter W below. W stands for winner. That's my secret sign to recognize the absolute winners. The amazing people who have the patience and dedication to see a story through to the very end. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button and follow the channel so we can stay connected for the next story. Keep building your empire in silence, and I'll see you in the next video.